East Germany was a democratic state, which allowed its citizens to live without fear for the future. No one had to worry they wouldn't have enough to eat.
A school child seeing this exhibition would think that East Germany was a completely normal democratic state. This is the message here, which I think is crazy.
What you just saw is two Germans expressing their opinions about the former German Democratic Republic, a period when part of the nation was under communist rule. As you can see, even today, there are those who still advocate for it, believing that life was better there than in capitalist West Germany. Similarly, there are those who view East Germany as a dictatorial and oppressive regime. But was it really like that? Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you about life in each of the two Germanys. To understand this history, we need to go back to the end of World War II. In 1945, after almost 6 years of fighting, the Third Reich surrendered to the Allies. There was nothing left to fight for. The country had been invaded by its enemies, Berlin lay in ruins, and Hitler had taken his own life. It marked the beginning of a new era, but rebuilding the nation would be no easy task. After all, Germany had been ruled for 12 years by one of the most violent dictatorships in history. While many Germans had realized this towards the end and withdrew their support from the regime, many others remained committed Nazis. The Allies decided not to repeat the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, which imposed humiliating conditions on Germany, contributing to the rise of someone like Hitler. Initially, the victors agreed to maintain an occupation government in the country, dividing Germany into 4 zones. The administrators were France, England, the United States, and the Soviet Union. However, the world was entering the Cold War, the confrontation between the capitalist and communist blocs. As expected, the conflict had repercussions on German territory, which in 1949 was reorganized into 2 new states. The Federal Republic of Germany aligned with the West, and the German Democratic Republic allied with the Soviets. Let's start by examining life in the West. The government of West Germany, aligned with the United States, was established in the city of Bonn in the North Rhine-Westphalia region. The man who dominated politics during the first 15 years of the Federal Republic was Konrad Adenauer, who served as chancellor. In the 1920s and 1930s, he had been a strong opponent of Nazism and had been arrested for resisting the dictatorship of the Third Reich. He had even come close to being sent to a concentration camp, but the end of the war came just in time to save him. By 1949, he was a 73-year-old man, but he was determined to rebuild his country and save it from the destruction left by Hitler. Here you can see him giving a speech, advocating for peace during a diplomatic visit to England.
Ich bin der britischen Regierung außerordentlich dankbar für die Einladung nach London. Ich hoffe von Herzen, dass die Unterredungen, die ich hier führen kann, beitragen zur Frieden und zur Verständigung in der ganzen Welt.
The Chancellor faced the dilemma of what to do with people who had been involved with Nazism. Adenauer's decision was highly controversial. He categorized collaborators of the Third Reich into different groups based on how firmly they had adhered to the regime. Criminals were excluded from the state, but those who were simple bureaucrats, or couldn't be proven guilty of any crime, were allowed to continue working in the government. At the same time, the Chancellor requested that the Allies release German officers who had been captured as prisoners of war. This aligned with Adenauer's plan to redeem the role of the Wehrmacht during World War II. This way, German troops would be remembered as heroic defenders of the nation, not associated with the atrocities of Nazism. On the contrary, the guilt for genocide, clandestine executions, and mass rapes was placed on the Waffen-SS, the armed wing of the Nazi Party. This was not entirely accurate, as the Wehrmacht had also been involved in war crimes. However, the Federal Republic made efforts to rewrite history so that Germans could reconcile with their abhorrent past. Similarly, the leaders of the July 1944 conspiracy were celebrated as heroes. On that occasion, a group of army officers tried to assassinate Hitler by planting a bomb in his personal retreat known as the Wolf's Lair. The plot failed and all those responsible were executed. Now, in the era of the new democracy, they received significant honors from the state to make Germans aware that not all soldiers sided with Nazism. The 1950s and 1960s are known as the years of the German economic miracle, as the Federal Republic experienced phenomenal growth. The Second World War had left a devastating landscape, with bombed factories, cities reduced to rubble, and entire villages destroyed. Just when it seemed that the country would sink into extreme poverty, Konrad Adenauer's government managed to pull it together, thanks to his political skill and, of course, the support of the United States. The Americans financed a large part of the reconstruction of West Germany, as it was a way to show the rest of the world that life was better there than in its communist counterpart. The ties between the US government and that of the Federal Republic were extremely close. Here is a snippet of President John F. Kennedy's visit to West Berlin, where he delivered one of his most famous speeches.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
In the West, one could say that Germans experienced a high quality of life. Culturally, it closely resembled that of any Western First World country. The economic situation seemed unbeatable, and, as if that weren't enough, there was unprecedented political stability. Peace had not reigned in the nation for a long time, as in 1914, the outbreak of World War I had sent them to arms. In the 1920s, the streets of the Weimar Republic were taken over by pitched battles between Nazis and communists, and violence reached unprecedented levels. From 1933, Hitler's dictatorship plunged the population into a state of constant terror and alertness, and later, the Second World War threw them back into the battlefield. However, it seemed that those times were behind them. There were no more wars or paramilitary groups causing havoc and murders everywhere. However, the Federal Republic was not entirely free of conflicts. To begin with, Adenauer allowed former members of the Nazi Party to be employed by the state. On the other hand, he negotiated with the victorious powers to ensure that German war criminals were not sentenced to death. The Chancellor always believed that Germany should solve its own problems without the intervention of other countries, and that's why, at the end of the war, he opposed the Nuremberg trials. In 1951, he succeeded in obtaining a pardon for 21 Wehrmacht officers, commuting their execution for a lighter punishment. Despite his leniency towards participants in the Nazi dictatorship, Konrad Adenauer was a highly popular leader, to the point that he governed West Germany for 4 consecutive terms, from 1949 to 1963. However, it's worth remembering that in March 1952, he survived an assassination attempt. On that occasion, a mysterious package arrived at the central offices of the Munich police. It was addressed to the Chancellor himself, which raised suspicions among the officers. When they tried to open it, the package exploded in a brutal blast, killing a police officer. It was a bomb designed by a Jewish paramilitary organization, Irgun, opposing the Chancellor. Years later, it was revealed that the operation was planned by Menachem Begin, the man who, curiously, would later become the Prime Minister of Israel. This was undoubtedly one of the most tense episodes in the Federal Republic. The rest of the conflicts were related to its communist counterpart. Tension between the two sides was significant for decades. Each claimed that the other was usurping territory that did not rightfully belong to them. Let's see what was happening in the eastern region. As soon as the fight against Hitler ended, the Soviets retaliated against the Germans by stealing all the industrial material they could find and sending it to their nation. They dismantled factories, looted public buildings, and took valuables from private homes. It is estimated that, in total, the Red Army appropriated wealth worth $10 billion in current prices. During their occupation, government, the Russians implemented a denazification policy that involved imprisoning tens of thousands of suspects who had collaborated with the Third Reich. This policy was clearly very different from that adopted by their capitalist counterparts. Here you can listen to Victor Grossman, who lived in the German Democratic Republic, recalling that measure.
I felt close to the GDR, why I really felt myself a part of it. One basic reason was because starting in 1945, under pressure from the Soviets who occupied it, they got rid of all of the war criminals who had been guilty of Hitler's crimes in the war. That's where these big industries, banks, and so forth, who had built Hitler up and profited from his war. They were all thrown out. And that, for me, was, as a Jewish anti-fascist, especially important.
Similarly, the most ardent opponents of communism were arrested. Their fate was the re-education camps, where they were taught the virtues of Joseph Stalin's regime. In 1949, the Soviet Union announced that it would end the occupation government and power would be handed over to the German Communist Party. From then on, the new authorities of the German Democratic Republic had to face tremendous economic hardships. The West was a thriving nation, supported by the United States and the Ruhr region, a mining basin full of industries that provided it with wealth. In contrast, the East had nothing similar, and the financial aid from the Soviet Union was not enough to alleviate the post-war misery. The main problem faced by this part of the German population was scarcity. East German industries did not have the capacity to meet the people's needs. Until well into the 1960s, there was a shortage of basic goods such as sugar, coffee, bananas, and at times, meat. Victor Grossman remembered it this way.
It was able to make sure that everybody had enough to get along, but an awful lot of goods were missing. Good, nice cars, even many fruits, bananas were short, for example, many other commodities, and this put them at such a disadvantage that many people thought, gee, we want to go across. And this forced, this meant a degree of repression, which was the basic negative part of East Germany.
For East Germans, it must have been frustrating to see their West German neighbors enjoying increasingly higher standards of living, while they had to scrape by to avoid starvation. The shortage reached its climax in the summer of 1953, when the crisis became so severe that there was a wave of protests against the government. Faced with demands for democratization and free elections, the authorities made a brutal decision. They requested the Soviet Union to suppress the demonstrations. In this way, the tanks of the Red Army once again roamed freely in towns and cities in Germany. Discontent was drowned in blood, and it is estimated that between 50 and 125 people died at the hands of Soviet troops. While this measure was successful in ending the protests, citizens began a massive exodus to the West. Aware that they were living under an authoritarian regime, millions of inhabitants of the German Democratic Republic decided to leave everything behind and start anew in the West. The escape route was through Berlin, as the city was divided into halves, each administered by one of the German governments. Therefore, it was extremely difficult for Eastern authorities to control migration movements. For this reason, in 1961, the Communist Party, tired of the population drain, began the construction of the famous Berlin Wall to decisively and definitively separate West Germany from East Germany. From then on, it would be almost impossible to escape to the Federal Republic. Nevertheless, the situation improved for those who remained in Communist Germany. The reason for this is somewhat ironic. The shortage of food and resources was resolved because the country lost a quarter of its population due to clandestine migrations. Now that 4 million fewer people lived in the German Democratic Republic, there was no more scarcity. Production was sufficient for those who stayed. However, East Germans faced other problems, such as a lack of freedom. The authorities had the infamous Stasi, an intelligence service that served the same functions as the KGB in the Soviet Union. Let's listen to Grossman's testimony again.
There was no freedom of the press, for example. The press, the publications, all the media were basically directed by the Central Party. That means there were variations and there were phases where it was stricter and less strict, but by and large, there was no freedom of the press. And also, people were not afraid of the Stasi and every word they said, this secret state security. They talked freely in private terms and generally, but in public, at meetings and so forth, people were careful as to what they said.
The Stasi had a network of informants distributed throughout the nation. In fact, it is estimated that it had 170,000 hidden watchers openly observing their neighbors and keeping an eye out for possible anti-communist activities. Thus, paranoia became an everyday occurrence in the German Democratic Republic, and its citizens learned to be constantly alert. As you can see, life could not have been more different in the two Germanys. The economy, politics, and culture were completely different in each. Brothers, friends, and couples were separated by the division between countries. The end of this story came in 1989, when East Germans protested against the communist regime and finally tore down the hated Berlin Wall, which had been the symbol of division among Germans for 3 decades. The Soviet bloc was in a terminal crisis from which it did not survive. From then on, East Germany integrated into the Federal Republic, ending the division and unifying the country. We have reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, would you have preferred to live in East Germany or West Germany? Leave your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.